Chapters 1 and 2 of Just Sweethearts, a Christmas Love Story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Just Sweethearts, a Christmas Love Story by Harry Stillwell Edwards. Chapter 1. Bathed in the sunshine of one of those perfect days which so often come with Christmas in the South, he stood at the street corner, a light cane across his shoulders, supporting his gloved hands, his eyes shifting with ever-changing interest and a half-smile on his swarthy face. It was written all over him that he had no appointments to meet, no duties to discharge, that he was by chance only in the moving picture and not of the cast, and that the whole thing, so far as he was concerned, was but a transient show to be enjoyed for its brilliancy of colors and its endless succession of fine Southern faces. But here was idleness without inertia. Clearly he was one of those rare beings who can radiate energy standing still and convey the impression of impetuous force without motion, a trick of the eyes, a refusal to sag. Name, ladies and gentlemen, meet King Dubignon. King saw her first as she started across Cherry Street from the far corner, a slender figure moving with grace and assurance through the dangerous procession of motor cars, still handled in the South as new toys, and once or twice his lips parted for a warning cry, but she gained the opposite corner with ease and turned straight toward him across Third. Now, of all the throng, his alert eyes clung to this approaching figure and began to take note of details: white spats, plain tailor suit, loose blousey waist, and flat hat with its little veil of black lace. Soon she was directly in front, but her demure gaze was not for him. She was mentally preoccupied. She had thoughts of her own, and not having seen the Dubignon eyes and smile, she failed to look back after she passed. The young man released a suspended breath like unto the fervid sigh of a cow settling down to rest, lowered his cane, and stood gazing after the receding figure. And not he only, as he noticed with quick jealousy. Every man and woman who met her turned for a second glance. The gentian eyes, radiant face, curved lips, parted in a half-smile, belonged in an artist's dream. The slender, supple figure borne along on dainty feet, the subtle grace of her moving, line vanishing into line, curve melting into curve, the free, elastic, boyish stride, were combinations notable even in the City of Beautiful Women, as the aborigines called their Macon. King was an artist and had dreamed. He had lost something out of his dreams, and now he found something to place in one. He followed and saw her vanish into the crowd of a cheap store, an emporium of 10-cent things. And presently his broad shoulders opened up a path there for himself. Down one aisle and up another, and then he found her. She was critically examining lace at 10 cents the yard, and did not look up as he passed. The purchase of lace of any kind is a tax on all the faculties if one is faithful. Checkmate? No. Inspiration. He went forward to the turn of the aisle at the show window near the door. It had occurred to him that sooner or later she would pass out. He took his stand in a little bay of space near by and waited. Time was no object to him at such a crisis. When he saw her coming again, threading her way through the crowd and almost without contact, he so maneuvered that she drifted naturally into the little bay promptly vacated for her accommodation. Instantly he was standing directly in front, hat in hand, arresting her departure. "Beautiful, just a moment, please," he said, smiling down. "I saw you crossing the street and followed you here. When you leave, I shall not follow again. Listen, what I am asking is that you will take my card and have your father or somebody inquire about me of one of the bank cashiers on the corner, and then write me your address, won't you? This isn't regular, I know. he continued with increase of vocal momentum, but it is necessary, absolutely necessary. I have searched and waited for you all my life, and if I lose you now, it may be forever." The girl had drawn back a little and was looking into his face with wonder, but without alarm. The Dubignon eyes and smile were irresistible. Nevertheless, now that he had spoken, words altogether different from the formal ones planned, King became self-conscious and troubled. Something jarred. Perhaps it was the 20th century, or the 10-cent store. Besides, he was pointing a piece of cardboard at her in what must have seemed a very absurd way. She felt instantly his embarrassment, and women of all ages gain composure when men in their presence lose it. The instinctive response of eyes and lips, vibrant life to impetuous youth, was checked, and a tiny perpendicular line divided her brows. "Are you quite sane?" she began, her voice reduced almost to a whisper. He thanked God for that. "Stand aside, please, or shall I send for the manager?" "Perfectly sane," he said, moving aside, but still holding out the card. "You will not send for anyone, because now the way is open. But all the same, I wish awfully you would take my card, and when you get home decide. Won't you, please? It's just a little lonesome card," he added whimsically. The girl hesitated, questioning him with the wonderful gentian eyes, into which, now of a sudden, came a fixed light. A white wonder paled her face for a fleeting instant, and she moved a step nearer. Doubtingly, the gesture clearly an unconscious one, her hand touched his arm. "Have I ever seen you before? Do you know my name?" He shook his head, smiling happily. She watched the smile with open interest. "Think again," she urged earnestly. He was deeply troubled. He wished that he might say he had met her as a summer girl somewhere, but he could not. What he did say was, "It may strike you as absurd, but I have only seen you in a dream, a long dream." She smiled over this, and with sudden decision took the card, dropping it into her shopping bag. "You are not to follow. You promised." "Cross my heart. I shall remain here 15 minutes. Can you vanish back into your sunbeam in 15 minutes?" "Completely." Her little laugh was the finest thing he had ever heard. She smiled up into his face and passed out. 15 minutes later, having, with the aid of a little lady of blonde accomplishments, selected a dozen pairs of crimson and green socks and paid for them, he looked at his watch. "My dear," he said, "I've changed my mind. There's really no room in my grip for this bundle. Christmas is at hand. Kindly hand them to Mother, with my best wishes." "And I have no mother, and I never saw him before," she said to the floor walker hysterically. "And red and green socks!" "Easy, Mash," he laughed. "He'll be back. Exchange for something else." She opened a tiny vanity box and powdered her nose. It was ammunition wasted. Fate is a merry jade at times. Halfway to Jacksonville in a Pullman next day, a young woman with gentian eyes, who had time and again searched her handbag, opened a package of cheap lace to finish dressing a Christmas doll, and a card dropped out. It bore the inscription, "King Dubignon." Underneath was penciled the information that he was associated with Beeker, Toomer and Church, Architects, New York, and to this was added, "Hotel Dempsey, Macon, 3 days." Fate's little jest was the concealment of the card in a fold of the paper wrapper for 24 hours. Chapter 2. When King Dubignon left Cornell and some 700 who had labored with him through several years of architecture and watercolor, he bore with him the consciousness that final examples of his work, left there, had not been excelled, and the memory of many friendly assurances that his place was waiting for him out in the great world. That he construed these assurances too literally was the fault of his temperament, and so perfectly natural. Home yearning pulled him back to his beloved South for the initial plunge, and it was not long before his name in gilt invited the confidence of the good people of Macon, who had castles in the air. The field proved narrow and depressing for one of his profession and temperament. The 7-room cottage of many colors seemed the limit of popular imagination at that time. This, for a young man who was bursting with ideas, and who dreamed of 35-story buildings and marble palaces printing graceful lines against skies of blue. The years that slipped held some minor triumphs, but he classed them as time wasted. Then a provincial board turned down his modern school building for a combination barn, silo, and garage, designed by somebody's nephew, and the proverbial straw was on the celebrated camel's back. It was a spring day when the camel's spine collapsed. Birds were building homes for themselves, and wonderful flowers were solving, without human aid, marvels of form and color, and voices were calling to him across years unborn. Ah, those voices! He placed a foot under the corner of his drawing table and wrecked it against the wall. 3 days later he was in New York, that Mecca of ambitious young Southerners, and at the door of Beeker, Toomer & Church, esteemed by him and many another as the great city's leading architects. Mr. Church, the junior partner, heard his application. A little smile hovered about the man's thin lips, and a slight movement of the lines leading southeast and southwest from the nostrils expressed a cynical weariness. "On an average," said he, with an air of calculation, "we have applications from Cornell men at the rate of 6 a week. And there are others." He waved a hand feebly toward a vista of rooms with bending forms therein. "We can't always keep the crowd we have busy." "I know all about that," said King coolly, "but perhaps you need a man in this special line. Art glass, stained glass windows." He opened a portfolio and laid some designs before the architect. Now, while no artist listens with patience to business argument, none refuses to listen to pictures. Mr. Church looked carelessly at first, then with a distinct show of interest. The sheets slipped rapidly through his hands, and he shot a swift glance at his visitor. "These yours?" "Yes." Mr. Church pressed a button somewhere, his eyes still on the designs. A little gate opened. "Come in," he said. And King Dubignon stood at the threshold of his career. Back in the junior partner's office the designs were more carefully examined. "Very creditable," was the grudging admission. "It so happens that we may be able to use a man in this line, temporarily. Be seated." He disappeared. When he returned he was accompanied by a stout man of perhaps 45, prompt of manner, and with a face that seemed to have been carved from tinted marble after a Greek model. This one, with quick eye, examined the designs, which he handled as an expert handles Sèvres. "Excellent! Yours?" "Yes," said King. "Where are you from?" "Georgia." "Learned this down there?" "Oh, partly, and partly at Cornell." "Nothing finer ever in this office, Church. You want to work with us, I suppose?" This to King. "If agreeable, sir." "All right. How does 2,500 strike you for a starter?" "Fine." And then, "Just what I made last year building freak cottages." Mr. Beeker laughed. "I know. Served my time on them. The young wife brings you a homemade ground plan, providing for hotel accommodations, and wants a roof put over it, bay windows, porte cochere, etc. Cries when she finds your roof will cost more than her cottage. You'll be under Mr. Church, Mr. Dubignon." "Good old name. Any advice needed, drop in on me." He shook hands and turned away, but came back and placed a finger on the pictures. "I say, Church, how about the memorial windows?" Yes, I think Mr. Dubignon might help. Better give him a free hand on it. A sudden flush overspread the Southerner's face, and his look of gratitude followed the great architect. But if King looked for sudden fame in New York, he was disappointed. Putting aside his ambition for the time being, he threw himself into the task of developing along the special line he had chosen for a foothold, with the same ardor that had carried him to the front at college, and his work stood all tests easily. Beeker, Toomer & Church became headquarters for art glass designs in architecture. Presently his salary rose, and then again, and at length he found himself independent. But, to use his own expression, he got nowhere. The reason was simple. It was a rule of the office that all designs should bear the firm's name only. Church had carefully explained this in the beginning. Church had also seen to it that press notices of their notable work invariably mentioned that Ralph Church was the head of the department responsible for it. King writhed under this system, but he could not budge without financial backing. He was heartily tired of his narrow field. At odd times, in his own living room, he worked on his ambitious dream. The dream of the young architect was a 35-story office building, wherein utility was to be combined with beauty, without sacrifice of dividend-paying space or money, and without offense to the artistic eye from any point of view. Many architects have wrestled with the same problem, and some with brilliant results. Now, by strange coincidence, a 35-story office building for Chicago, financed in New York, began to be talked of in building circles. No plans had been asked, no consultation with architects had. A rumor had started and was kicked around as a football. King took the backward trail and patiently followed it into the office of a certain great banker whose young woman secretary had a friend that served an afternoon paper in reportorial capacity. Here King met his Waterloo, for no man in New York was less accessible than this particular banker, who had once received a Black Hand letter. Red tape, red-headed office boy, confidential clerks, private secretary, hemmed him in from all but his selected associates, and the banker's offices were full of unsuspected exits. All roads led from his Rome. King stalled at the red-headed boy, the extreme outer guard. It was at this stage of his career that he put aside ambition and raced off to Georgia for a few days along the coast. One proved sufficient. He spent that laying holly wreaths on graves under mossy live oaks. Then he betook himself to Macon to lunch and dine and sup with his old-time S.A.E. friends of Mercer, scene of his earliest college years. He found them in law offices, doctor shops, banks, and trade, glad to see him, but busy. Then, bankrupt of emotions, he began to stand on the street corners during their busy hours and watch the people pass. And watching thus, he had seen her. And finally, after 3 days more in his hotel, much boring of friends and many fruitless chases of false rumors, and hours in front of Wesleyan College, he had arrived at the conclusion that he was, after all, a sublime ass. Bearing this added burden, he had taken himself off to New York in what old-time writers were pleased to call a frame of mind. But at the bottom of a formidable array of Christmas greetings piled on his desk by his devoted friend, Terence the office boy, he found an envelope postmarked Jacksonville, Florida, December 25. Within was a card, one of the kind sold 5 for a nickel, bearing these lines: "I found your card in my bag on my way to Florida. Am keeping it in memory of the only impudence I have ever encountered at the hands of a man. Nevertheless, I am wishing for you a very happy Christmas and New Year. This, I take it, is the proper Christmas spirit. Beautiful. P.S. Very likely I shall return to New York before Easter." And for King Dubignon, Christmas came back. Also for Terence. The tip was $5 and an injunction. Small boy, note this handwriting. You will perceive that it is more of a jumping than a running hand. Well, it belongs on the top of all mail. Understand?" "I'm on," said Terence with his broadest grin. "Return to New York," quoted King, self-communing. "I should have known from the way she crossed the street she belonged in New York." "Sir?" "On your way, Terence, on your way." But this with a smile. End of chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 and 4 of Just Sweethearts, A Christmas Love Story by Harry Stillwell Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Lent was well under way, and the first Easter displays in show windows, when on a Saturday morning King found a little note perched on the top of his office mail, which read: "If you will be at the old Delmonico corner near Union Square Saturday at 4 p.m., you may walk with me as far as 23rd Street, on condition that you turn back there, and in the meantime ask me no questions. Don't come if the conditions don't suit." Whence she came he never knew, but as he stood waiting she appeared before him, her face radiant, her gentian eyes smiling up to his. He lifted his hat quickly and fell into step with her along the east side of Broadway. Now that the supreme moment had arrived, he raged inwardly that a species of dumbness should have seized upon him. Turning her head away, the girl laughed softly. She had no fears. The subtle instinct of her sex had informed her that it was not a contest between man and girl, but between woman and boy. The discovery pleased her. And then, smiling, she challenged him. "Well, sir, what have you to say for yourself?" King rallied. "This. You are to marry me, of course. That was arranged in the beginning of all things. The important thing now is to get acquainted." Again the low, sweet laugh and upturned face. "Sounds like the verdict of a fortune-teller. One of your old South Atlantic voodoos been earning $1?" He was amazed. It was not to be the last time this girl was to amaze him. She was an amazing girl. "Why place me at the South Atlantic?" "Oh, my! Innocent! Doesn't everybody know Charleston and Savannah brogue when they hear it?" "Close, but it was a little further down. Are we so distinct, though?" "Nobody can imitate it. I've tried. The fraud was apparent. My poor voice sticks. I can't change it." "God forbid! But, getting back to the wedding, I am in earnest." "And you don't even know my name." "I have name enough for two." "Nor who I am." "I know who you will be. That's enough." "Nor if I am nice." "Don't jest." "Nor my profession. I may be an artist's model, soubrette, chorus girl, paid companion, waitress, manicurist, or lady's maid." She glanced down at her very homely dress. "I don't care what your profession has been. I can look into your face and see that it has been honorable. It's going to be Mrs. King Dubignon. Look up. I love you. Can't you see it?" Her eyes, swimming in light and laughter, met his. "You absurd boy! Do you always make love this way? Is it the custom a little further down than Charleston and Savannah?" "I have never before spoken of love to a girl. My lips have never touched a girl's. And then I have been waiting for you." A deep flush suffused her neck and face, and for the first time she betrayed confusion. "Don't, please," she whispered. "It is impossible that any man could love any girl so suddenly. And I don't like to be treated as a silly." King had whirled suddenly and was facing her. "Impossible? Do you know that it takes all the will power I can exert to keep from snatching you up in my arms? I resist because I don't want to frighten you. What do I care for people, for Broadway? This is the 20th century. We haven't time to play guitars under windows or sit in the moonlight week after week testing our emotions. We live by faith, move by faith. Faith in ourselves first, because if we are square, that's faith in God. And then by faith in our women. And when they are square, that's trust in God. We don't just meet the women He creates for us. We have known them all along. We just recognize them and take their hands in ours for eternity. My soul has been sitting at the window all my life, waiting, watching. I have found you. Name? Family? Occupation? They are hung on human beings as so many garments. I don't know any of yours, but I recognized you at the first glance. You are for me, and I for you, and in your heart you know it. Come, oh, come, she whispered, hurriedly, paling a little. We must not stand talking on the street. See, people are beginning to stare. You are making me conspicuous. He followed her in silence, disdaining to look about him, but already regretting his outburst. It had gathered more force and emphasis than he intended. His moodiness returned. Where were all the fine things he had planned to say? What a thistle-eater he was! They had reached Madison Square. She regained composure first and seated herself on a convenient bench. He heard again the sweet low laughter and felt her eyes looking up to him. Funny, isn't it? He questioned ruefully. Immense. Very prompt. You believe me, nevertheless. Oh, I believe you do. But come, sit down and tell me about that home a little further down than Charleston and Savannah. Coast? Island, he said, rather glad of the change. Surf and all that, I suppose? Nothing finer on the ocean. Coney Island, Rockaway, Cape May, Atlantic City. Why, the surf there is a ripple compared with Cumberland and Tybee. You swim, of course. All islanders swim, like river rats. You should see the breakers at Cumberland, 20 miles of them down to Dungeness. It takes a swimmer to get through there and back when the wind is in the northeast. But it's second nature with the natives. They ride the combers like wild horses. How long have you ever been in the water, there among the wild horses? She leaned forward eagerly, her eyes searching his every feature. 10 hours once. You see, I was pretty small, and the tide took me out. But it couldn't drown me, and a lumber boat happened along. But if the boat hadn't happened along? Oh, the tide would have brought me back. Dead, maybe, but I think not. I am a floater. Some swimmers are not balanced right for floating. Women hardly ever. She gave him a friendly smile. And there is where your home is? What the war left of it, 2 wings of a cochina house and an unbroken view of desolation. But it was home. Now you are talking sensibly. Home, that's always worth talking about. Let's quit the foolish love business. And yet it is love that makes the home. True, but think of a home where the wife was won, a stranger, by a stranger, on the street. Oh, that is strongly put. I had not thought of it that way. Better now than too late. The answer is, in my case, that you are not a stranger. Outside of every man's life there is a woman standing. Just outside, her radiance across his path. He is always conscious of her there, but he cannot see her. He finds himself striving because of her, ambitious because of her. Then one day she steps in and he recognizes her. And because of her he keeps his soul clean and face to the sunrise. Some call her the ideal, but I know her as the woman God made for me. Now you understand what I meant when I said I had waited for you all my life. What a beautiful thought! It's not my fault I met you on the street. Perhaps it may not always be on the street. You mean you will let me come to see you some day? I am not suggesting that. Then you never will? I have not said so. He relapsed into moody silence. "Listen," she said, at length picking up the loose end. "You are not altogether a stranger, either." Again that swift, half-mocking, upward smile. "Outside of every girl's life there is a man standing, just outside, his shadow across her path. She is always conscious of him there. She knows him as the man God made for her, but she cannot see him. Then one day he steps in and she recognizes him." "What a beautiful thought!" he echoed. And then, "Down in Macon, for instance, did you recognize me?" "I am inclined to think I did," she answered with a faint smile. "Nevertheless, I took you at your word and asked about you." "In Macon?" "No, silly! What did you learn?" "Oh, that you are a talented young draughtsman and ambitious. Also you are a dreamer, an impetuous dreamer. You certainly are that. If I were an adventuress as well as penniless, I might marry you and take chances on your success. I could always quit, you know. But I am not an adventuress, and marriage is impossible for us." "Why impossible?" The sun was gone. "There is a fact. I can't tell you now, and you were to ask me no questions. But the fact is now insurmountable." "Tell me that fact." "I cannot. But on my honour, if I did, you would not want to marry me. You would leave me on the street and never return." Her face, now grave and earnest, was lifted fearlessly, and her eyes met his in sincerity. His dumb distress touched her. Her colour deepened a little, the passing of a thought. The light of battle flashed in his brown eyes. "Here is the limit you set, Madison Square. Here is my answer. The only fact I recognize is, you have stepped into my life. You are my woman. Beautiful, come with me to the City Hall for a license, and then to the minister. Yonder is a taxi. I love you. I'd just as lieve marry you out of the street as out of a palace." He drew a thin circlet of gold from his finger. "Here is my mother's wedding ring, almost her sole legacy to me. It goes with my faith that you are the kind of woman she was." Mist was in the eyes, turned suddenly away, and then back to him. Her face glowed with an almost unearthly light and beauty. She reached out, took the ring, kissed it, and handed it back. "With reverence," she said tenderly, "but I cannot wear it. There is a reason why I cannot. It's not for me now. You'll know some day." Mystified, he stood silently watching her face. And then, "You'll see me again soon, won't you?" "Perhaps. But I am not always free. I shall have to pick a time. Now you go back, please. I must go on. But wait. I want to thank you for that faith. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever known. It would not be hard to learn to love such a boy." She smiled divinely. "Good-bye." One of them looked back after the parting. The psychologists know which. Chapter 4. 4 days of suffering registered on the Southerner. In the hours when he should have been sleeping, he picked at the meshes that held him. It was true that he seemed to have always been conscious of this girl, whose vivid beauty now enslaved him. These artists have wider worlds than the common run of humans. But what fact had she in mind, which, if revealed, would make his love impossible? Who and what was she? He gathered the threads of evidence. Her time was not her own. She was, by her own admission, or so he construed it, penniless. He had met her when offices were discharging stenographers for the day, and shop girls were beginning to start homeward. When she left him, she went in the direction of the theatre district. But why shouldn't he marry a stenographer, or an actress, or a shop girl, or even a model, or manicurist, or a lady's maid, if she were square? What had her occupation to do with his happiness? King was younger than his years, as are most Southerners, but he was sensitive to delicate influences. Without analysis, he knew that this girl had touched an atmosphere of refinement and was educated, and she had traveled. But what was so poor a girl doing in Charleston and Savannah and Macon? It sounded like a theatrical route. One day, on impulse, he consulted a theatrical agency and learned that Naughty Marietta had been in Macon on the 23rd of December and Jacksonville on the 24th. He knew the opera and had seen its array of beauties, and yet he could not figure out why, being of the Marietta Company, should keep her from marrying him. And there came the devil's hand in his affairs, but these theater girls marry so recklessly. King sat up in bed when this thought arrived, and uttered a word he had learned from his grandfather's overseer. It was not a nice word. And yet, and here a gentler voice intervened, and yet, don't you know the girl isn't married? Don't you know? Of course he knew. The girl was not married. Then what the thunder was all the row about? Father in the penitentiary? Mother scrubbing office buildings for a living? Brother a pickpocket? Sister gone to the bad? Tuberculosis? Pellagra? Not these latter, certainly. And what had the others to do with her marrying him? Nothing, if he had a say-so. He dismissed them with a mental finger-snap and put his faith again in destiny. She was his woman. He would win her in spite of herself. Then, on the 5th day, came a little note. He was to be at the entrance to the Metropolitan Museum at 1 hour past high noon. He was there promptly. She descended from a bus at the corner and came to him rapidly. "Inside," she said, smiling, but passing. He followed. Inside she fell back with him. Then came the quick, characteristic upward look. The gentian eyes were troubled. "What have you been doing to yourself, little boy? Are you working too hard?" "Scarcely that," he laughed, "but possibly sleeping less than usual." "And you?" "But why ask? You are the same radiant, beautiful girl as when I first saw you." "Don't, please. I detest flattery." "The word beautiful doesn't flatter you. But I think I understand. However, if I'm not to call you that, what am I to do for a name? Can't you trust me with some little old name?" "My uncle calls me Billy when he finds me amiable, Bill when he is displeased, and William when he is out of all patience. You can take them, all three. You'll need them later." "Miss Billy will do for me." "Billy or nothing, sir." "All right. Now then, Billy, listen to me. You've been through this place?" "Dozens of times. I suggested it because at this hour it is not frequented because it is apt to be uncrowded, and I want to be alone with you. Forgive me if I shock you." "Forgive you? Come, I know a place where few people will be passing. It is both public and private." "All right. Let's go sit down and tell glad stories of live kings." "Good paraphrase. Where did you learn the original?" "Oh, I read to an old lady friend a great deal. I'm learning lots of pretty things in books." Lightly touching her arm, he guided her to a broad seat screened by a marble group at the far end of the hall. "Here is the place. Now I have a confession to make. I have not been strictly true to you, to myself." "Been flirting elsewhere?" "The truth is, I inquired of a theatrical agency what company was in Macon on December 23rd, the day I met you, and was informed it was Naughty Marietta. That is all. Don't think I am asking you a question. It makes no difference to me if you are Marietta herself or a chorus girl." Billy gasped, and after a swift glance to his solemn face, laughed until her eyes swam in tears. "You dear boy! No, I am not an actress. That is, professionally. I went to Jacksonville, since you want to know, as Can you stand a shock?" "Don't tell me. I don't care to know." She picked at a darned place in her glove. "As the companion of an old lady. Are you very much disappointed?" "Happy old lady!" said King fervently. "Disappointed? I have an intense admiration for the girl who earns her own living. But, Billy, why work?" "Don't. You have forgotten the fatal fact." "But there is no fact that can be fatal to us, unless you are already married." She considered this a moment, her face very grave. "And you think it possible that I might be married and at the same time willing to meet you this way? How could you love such a person?" "I don't think so," said King miserably, in over his head. "But there are only two things that could keep me from you, death and marriage. And believe me, Billy, you are far from dead." Then suddenly the little hand was slipped in his, and he saw his own image in the gentian eyes. "King, you will let me call you that, won't you? My King. Oh, don't you understand? There must be a mystery between us. How long, the good God only knows, but it may not keep us from each other all the time. Can't we be just sweethearts till then? Don't you know I love to be with you, and would love you if I might? Don't you know? Don't you know, King?" The inevitable happened. She was swept up in the arms of the young man, and his lips were pressed to hers. For one long moment, while the world swam about her and her heart stood still, she lay unresisting, helpless. Then he released her and leaped to his feet. "My God!" he cried in a whisper, staring at her incredulous. "Can you ever forgive me? I was crazy, mad. I did not know what I was doing. Billy, go! Leave me and never come back. I deserve it." He was trembling from head to foot. She arose with slow dignity, her face very pale, and tidied her slightly disarranged dress, her eyes timidly searching the perspective ahead, and lips quivering. There was but one couple in view, and their backs were turned. "King," she said, "you must promise me you'll never do that again. You must, King, or I shall have to leave you and not return." "I swear it. Never until you lay your head on my breast of your own free will." But presently she turned and faced him bravely, her eyes again on his. A new note was in her voice. She seemed older. "King, I can't bear to see you look unhappy, and I am not a hypocrite. I forgive you because I am glad you kissed me, just once, and in that way. Now, I do not doubt—" "You cannot doubt." "I do not doubt myself. King, my splendid boy. Oh, this is shameful." She choked, covered her eyes with one hand, stretched the other blindly toward him, but before he could take it, was gone. He stood as she left him, looking down the vista through which she fled, but seeing nothing. Presently he pressed the back of one hand to his eyes, and then examined it in wonder. "Oh, Terence, Terence, what would you give to see that? You'd blackmail me 50 years." End of chapters 3 and 4.